It was really doomed from the outset in many ways. And Diana was not the pliant, conventional daughter of an earl that one might have expected. She had an independent thought, but she was great cunning, she was very smart, she was witty and fast.
For more than 2 centuries, the Spencer family was treated as the gold standard of English pedigree. Old land, old titles, a name that appears again and again in the great peerage volumes that catalogue Britain's aristocracy. When Lady Diana Spencer walked up the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral in 1981, genealogists had already combed through her family tree with a kind of obsessive detail usually reserved for royalty itself. Nobody expected any surprises. The Spencers were about as thoroughly documented as an English family could be, and the working assumption, never stated outright, but baked into every account of her ancestry, was that her bloodline was purely, unbrokenly European. That assumption turned out to be wrong. And the way it was proven wrong is one of the strangest quiet stories to come out of the modern royal family. In 2013, a genetic ancestry company called Britain's DNA, working with geneticist Dr. Jim Wilson, ran mitochondrial DNA tests on saliva samples taken from 2 of Diana's relatives, people who shared her direct maternal line but had never met one another. The idea was to trace that line as far back as the historical record would allow, and mitochondrial DNA is uniquely suited to the job. Unlike most of the genome, which is a shuffled mix of both parents passed down and reshuffled every generation, mitochondrial DNA comes only from the mother. A father cannot pass it to his children at all. It moves in a single unbroken thread, mother to daughter, virtually unchanged for hundreds of years, which makes it one of the most reliable tools available for tracing a specific ancestral woman across time. Whatever else happened to the rest of the family tree, however many husbands married in, however many records were rewritten or quietly dropped, the mitochondrial line could not be altered. It simply carried forward, generation after generation, the genetic signature of one specific woman at the root of it. That is exactly what the test found. Both relatives carried a rare mitochondrial signature belonging to haplogroup R30b. When Britain's DNA checked it against a database of more than 65,000 individuals worldwide, they found only 14 other people who carried it. 13 were from India. 1 was from Nepal. Not a single other match existed anywhere in Europe. The related sub-branches of the same haplogroup family were, without exception, South Asian in origin. There was no ambiguity in the result and no plausible alternative explanation. Somewhere back along Diana's direct maternal line, an Indian woman had entered the family. Rather than being an isolated curiosity, the discovery had real weight, because it meant the line running down to Diana, and through her to her sons, had quietly carried this genetic signature for generations while the family's own paper record insisted on something else entirely. The scientists were also careful about what the result did and did not mean. Mitochondrial DNA marks a single line of descent. It doesn't measure how much of a person's overall ancestry comes from any one source. When Britain's DNA additionally examined the autosomal DNA of Diana's 2 tested relatives, the broader mix of genetic material inherited from all ancestors, not just the maternal line, the actual proportion of South Asian ancestry it produced was small, well under 1%, spread across a handful of identifiable DNA segments. That's exactly what you'd expect after 7 or 8 generations of dilution. The headline wasn't the percentage. The headline was the identity of the woman at the source of that unbroken maternal thread, and the fact that the family had spent 200 years pretending she didn't exist the way she actually did. Her name was Eliza Kevork, and by the time science finally found her, she had been reduced to a single word in the family record: Armenian. Eliza was born around 1790 in Surat, a busy trading port on India's western coast, north of Bombay, where ships from half a dozen nations loaded and unloaded cargo along the waterfront, and merchants from Persia, Armenia, Portugal, the Netherlands, and Britain all did business more or less side by side. It was a genuinely cosmopolitan place, and Eliza herself sat at an intersection that made her hard to categorize by the rigid standards of the era. Her father's family carried an Armenian surname, and Armenian communities had long been established in Surat as traders and Christians, a background that carried real social weight in a colonial world obsessed with drawing lines between respectable and native. Being Armenian, in British eyes, was something close to acceptable. Foreign, certainly, but Christian, literate, commercially useful, not quite as alarming as being simply Indian. That distinction would matter enormously to what happened to Eliza's story later. But her father's Armenian name was only half the picture. Her maternal line, the line that mitochondrial DNA actually tracks, was Indian, And it was that maternal line, not the surname on paper, that the genetics eventually confirmed beyond argument. It's worth sitting with how deliberate this distinction was. Eliza wasn't a fabrication. She was a real woman with a real mixed heritage, and the family didn't invent a person to cover for her. They simply chose to emphasize the half of her identity that colonial society found tolerable and let the other half quietly disappear from the paperwork. That is a subtler and, in some ways, more effective kind of erasure than an outright lie. You don't have to invent anything. You just decide which true thing gets remembered. Around 1809, a young Scottish merchant named Theodore Forbes arrived in Surat, employed by the East India Company and stationed thousands of miles from anyone who had known him growing up. Through Eliza's brother-in-law, who worked as his local agent, Forbes and Eliza came into each other's lives, and what followed was not a brief or incidental arrangement. Later documents would flatten her role down to housekeeper, but the relationship that actually existed between them produced 2 children, a daughter, Catherine, always called Kitty, born in 1812, and a son, Alexander, and a household that, for a period of years, functioned in every practical sense as a family. Eliza was not simply managing Forbes's domestic affairs. Company men in India depended on relationships and local knowledge that outsiders simply didn't have access to, and a woman with Eliza's connections and fluency across communities would have been indispensable to a young merchant trying to build a career from nothing in an unfamiliar port. Whatever a legal document later called her, the substance of their years together tells a different and much more human story. That story did not survive contact with the world Forbes was trying to climb into. In the earliest decades of British trade in India, relationships between company men and Indian women were common and largely unremarkable. Plenty of merchants and officers built lasting families with local partners, and colonial society mostly looked the other way. But as the decades wore on, attitudes hardened. The empire became more rigid about class and race, more anxious about drawing sharp lines between ruler and ruled, and a man with ambitions of a partnership in Bombay, the kind of position that could set him up for life, increasingly could not afford to be publicly attached to a woman of Indian heritage, whatever she had contributed to his life and his fortune. As Forbes's career advanced, the calculation around Eliza shifted from personal to purely reputational, and he made his choice. He moved on toward the more respectable life Bombay society expected of him, and he handled the unraveling of his life with Eliza at a distance, through intermediaries rather than face-to-face. What Eliza felt about this did not go entirely unrecorded, which is unusual and, in its own way, remarkable. A collection of her letters survived, carried back to Britain among Forbes's papers, sitting for generations in archives few people thought to open, written in a hand few people in Scotland could read. Eliza could not write English fluently enough to compose them herself, so she dictated them to a local scribe, and at the bottom of each one she added her own signature in Armenian script, the one part of the letter she wrote with her own hand. In them, she pleaded to remain close to Forbes and their children, and she asked, above all, to be allowed to keep her daughter. Catherine was going to be sent to a country Eliza had never seen, to be raised among people she would never meet, and Eliza clearly understood exactly what that separation would mean before it happened. The letters are not the record of a servant negotiating severance terms. They are the record of a mother trying, through a stranger's handwriting, to hold on to her child. She was not able to. When Theodore Forbes died at sea in 1820, on a voyage back toward Britain, his will settled the matter in language that made his priorities unambiguous. Eliza was named in the will essentially as a housekeeper, left a small annuity that was later reduced, and described, in the era's own careful, distancing vocabulary, as Catherine's purported mother, a phrase designed to hold the relationship at arm's length even while acknowledging it existed. And yet the same will left Catherine, the daughter who carried Eliza's mitochondrial line, a substantial inheritance, 50,000 Bombay rupees, enough to make her a viable match for a respectable Scottish marriage. Her brother Alexander, meanwhile, was left in India. The son, who could not pass on that maternal genetic thread even if he had stayed, was set aside. The daughter, who carried it in every cell of her body without anyone alive at the time having any way of knowing that, was the one taken across an ocean and folded into a new identity, a new country, and eventually a new family name. Kitty was around 6 years old when she was sent to Scotland. She grew up there, married into the well-established Crombie family, and by every account became fully absorbed into respectable Scottish society, the India of her early childhood essentially erased from the story she was allowed, or expected, to tell about herself. What she could not erase, because neither she nor anyone else in the family had any means of knowing it was there, was what sat quietly and permanently inside her own cells, an unbroken mitochondrial line running straight back to Eliza Kewark of Surat. It passed from Kitty to her own daughter, and from that daughter onward, mother to daughter, through Scottish and English households for generation after generation, invisible, undetectable by any method available at the time, carried the way people carry the color of their eyes without giving it a second thought. Eventually that line reached a woman named Ruth, then a woman named Frances, and on the 1st of July 1961, to Frances came a daughter, Diana Frances Spencer. Inside that child, present in the mitochondria of every one of her cells from birth, sat the same signature that had originated in a port city on India's western coast roughly a century and a half earlier, a fact nobody in the family had any reason to suspect and nobody had the tools to detect until genetic testing caught up with history in 2013. What makes this story more than a genealogical footnote is how the family actually reacted once the results came out. There was no scandal, no denial, no closing of ranks. According to later accounts, Diana's own relatives had grown up entirely inside the sanitized Armenian version of Eliza's story. One aunt said plainly that even her own mother appeared to have had no knowledge that Kitty's mother was part Indian, suggesting the truth had simply been allowed to fade out of family memory rather than actively concealed generation after generation. When the science surfaced it, the wider family's response, by most accounts, leaned toward interest and even a kind of pride rather than embarrassment. It's a small but telling detail. The shame that shaped Eliza's erasure belonged entirely to the world she lived in, not to the people 2 centuries later who finally learned the truth about where part of their family came from. There's also a layer of irony sitting underneath all of this that's worth pulling out. Long before the mitochondrial results, royal genealogists had already established that Diana, technically an outsider marrying into the monarchy, actually carried, through various tangled and sometimes illegitimate branches, a stronger claim to old British royal blood than the family she married into, tracing distantly back toward Mary, Queen of Scots. The royal house itself, meanwhile, had changed its own name from a German one to Windsor within living memory, for reasons that had everything to do with public image during the First World War. So the family that had spent 2 centuries quietly editing an Indian great-great-great-grandmother out of its story in order to appear more purely English was, in the most literal genealogical sense, already more deeply rooted in Britain's own tangled royal past than the crown itself, while simultaneously carrying, unacknowledged, a direct genetic line back to the Indian subcontinent. That maternal thread did not stop with Diana. It passed once more, from mother to son, to her elder child, the future king. Because mitochondrial DNA only travels through mothers, this is very likely the first documented instance of proven South Asian maternal ancestry reaching directly into the British monarchy, carried not through some distant, diffuse mixing of populations over centuries, but through one specific, identifiable, unbroken line from one specific woman. And because that line only moves through daughters, it also has a defined endpoint. William and his brother Harry both carry it. Neither of them can pass it on to children of their own, because mitochondrial inheritance stops wherever the chain runs out of mothers. 200 years after Theodore Forbes's will send a 6-year-old girl across an ocean rather than let her stay with her mother, the line that decision was meant to protect, the respectable English line, turns out to have been carrying an Indian woman's genetic signature the entire time. And within another generation or two, once it finishes passing through the men who currently hold it, that signature will simply come to rest. Strip away the royal trappings and what's actually left is a very ordinary, very human story about the mechanics of erasure. Eliza Kewark was a real woman who built a life and a family in a port city, who was fluent enough across cultures and languages to make herself indispensable to a foreign merchant trying to establish himself, who dictated letters to a stranger because she couldn't write English herself, and who signed her own name in the one script she knew because it was the only piece of the letter that was entirely hers. She lost her daughter to a decision made mostly through intermediaries, by a man who couldn't be seen, in the world he was trying to enter, to have a partner of her background. The family record that followed didn't need to invent a lie from nothing, it just needed to keep emphasizing the Armenian half of a true story and let the Indian half quietly stop being mentioned, generation after generation, until nobody left alive remembered it had ever been there to begin with. What the DNA test did, more than 200 years later, wasn't uncover some hidden scandal for its own sake. It reconnected a family with a woman they'd been unknowingly carrying inside them the entire time, in every cell, through every wedding and christening and quiet Scottish dinner table, completely unaware. The paper record could be edited. The will could use careful, distancing language. The family story could settle comfortably on Armenian, and leave it there for 2 centuries. But the one record inside the body itself, the sealed mitochondrial line passed intact from mother to daughter, never changed and never lied, and eventually a saliva sample and a laboratory test were enough to make it speak. Eliza Kevork disappeared from the official story almost completely. She did not disappear from the family. She simply waited, quietly, inside them, until the science finally caught up enough to say her name out loud again.